So we will get started shortly. We have some more people in person trickling in, and I want to welcome everyone here in the room and also in our Zoom room. So for those of you here in person, we have some folks joining us online who either because they're joining us over their lunch hour or farther afield are joining us that way. We're happy to have all of you. We're also especially happy to have books joining us today. So we have collections from our collections here at McGill and also from the Jewish Public Library. So I will introduce myself and do a couple of housekeeping notes, and then we'll get going, which I actually should look at my notes for. I'm Jacquelyn Sundberg. That's a good way to start. I'm outreach librarian here for Rare Books and Special Collections, and I also curate our children's and cookbooks collection, neither of which you see today. But today I am delighted and really was privileged to work with our Judaica collections and make some selections. We are co-hosting today with colleagues from the Jewish Public Library and from McGill's Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. We're gathering today to hear stories of some of the Judaica collections, both here at McGill and at the Jewish Public Library, in remembrance of the Holocaust. So to get started, I want to take a minute and think about the place where we are. It's always a pleasure to bring together collections from disparate institutions. And today, the books that we're gathering to hear about and to see come from all over the globe. And they've passed through many hands, both known and unknown, before they found their stewards in Montreal libraries at McGill and the Jewish Public Library. And the land where McGill and the Jewish Public Library stand has long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We honor, recognize, and respect these nations as the stewards, the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we're meeting today. They are also stewards of the knowledge that is specific to this place and that of the kind that is difficult to list in a library catalog. So today we are discussing Jewish books and material culture that come to this place from much further afield. Throughout the event, for those of you tuning in online, we do welcome respectful chat and engagement in the Zoom chat. I have my colleague today helping out, Michelle McLeod. You can wave to the in-person room, but you can reach out to Michelle with questions, or you can also email us at roar.library@mcgill.ca. Chat, as I said, is welcome. For those of you here in the room, thank you for leaving your jackets and bags because we have materials out today. It's a little different setup, so thank you. I hope you all have a sweater though, because our room is a little chilly. So we're keeping it the temperature of the books rather than the people. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to invite my colleague, Dr. Rachel Hatcher from the McGill Office for Religious and Spiritual Life to tell us more about the Holocaust Remembrance Week here at McGill. Rachel.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone here for attending online and also in person. So as many of you may know, this coming Saturday, January 27th, is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The date marks this year the 79th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp. McGill began to celebrate, or I should say commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day last year as part of the commitments made in the 2022 Initiative Against Islamophobia and Anti-Semitism. This year, McGill is happy to expand those series of events, to a series to further contribute to the commitments made. So this year, we are very happy to then co-host the event that you're here to participate in. Oh, we can go forward. There's another one. Oh, that beautiful book. Yes, thank you. So this year, these events include this joint event with the Rare Books Special Collections of McGill and the Jewish Public Library's Rare Book Collection. For those of you who do not know the Jewish Public Library's Rare Book Collection, the collection comprises about 1,800 volumes dating from 1481 all the way through the 19th century. The books span an array of areas from early Hebrew grammars, Talmudic works, liturgical, Kabbalistic, and ethical treatises, and also books and works that are more tangential to Jewish life. For the last 9 years, the JPL has been taking these books to universities, to secondary schools, to cégep, community centers, museums, and other cultural institutions to share their research in the material history of medieval and early modern Jewish life, as told through the narrative record of printers and authors. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Eddie Paul back to McGill. Eddie oversees collections, development, cataloging, and reference services at the JPL, and for the last few years has also developed education outreach programming. This includes the Michael D. Paul Rare Books Initiative, the Where Do You Think You Come From genealogy workshops for young people, and a series of other projects designed to create convergences between the JPL's archive and special collections and the public through storytelling. In 2014, he curated the JPL's first rare book exhibit and catalog entitled A Room Full of Dwellings, in addition to having co-curated an exhibit in 2017 with the Jacob Lowy collection of at Libraries and Archives Canada, entitled Decanting Memory, 500 Years of Jewish Printing. The Rare Book Workshop program has included collaborations with Libraries and Archives Canada, the University of Toronto, McGill, Carleton, the Montreal Holocaust Museum, the National Library of Israel, as well as important Judaica rare book collections in universities across the United States. So Eddie, I will give the floor to you, and thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'd like to thank as well Jacquelyn and Rachel for organizing this with us, as well as the staff at ROAR for helping to make this happen. I'd also like to thank my two colleagues, Isel Carter and Ellen Belshaw, the outreach coordinators who work with me on this project, on this ongoing initiative. I'm a little humbled by all these accomplishments. I know I wrote this bio, but it really sounds like a different person. It just doesn't seem like me. And welcoming me back to McGill too, that also felt a little strange because I haven't actually been a student here for. I'm not going to tell you. Well, it's estimated that there were 40 to 45,000 children who were orphaned or abandoned after the Holocaust. Initially I was going to keep this to about 15 minutes, but in trying to take ownership over the idea of provenance, which is a bit of an irony, it may take a few more minutes. In any case, estimated about from between 40 to 45,000 children who were orphaned or abandoned after the Holocaust. Now, by no means, pardon? Okay, oh, I'm sorry. By no means do we want to dishonor this fact, but in deciding to call this event Provenance, that helps. In deciding to call this event Provenance and the Orphans of Offenbach, we wanted a metaphor that underlies the connection Judaism has with books. We acknowledge that provenance, which is the history of an object's custodial ownership, is of vital importance to rare book research. And I've always likened this to tracing your family tree. I've done several genealogy workshops for young people that are intended to help get them connect to their own history with a broader Jewish history. But how do you establish the genealogy of a book's custodianship when that book has no book stamps, marginalia, signatures, or anything that traces it to its previous caretakers? Even if our books had stamps, we're a small resource-strapped public library, and we've never really had the means to spend a lot of time on provenance research. There's another way, however, that we can rationalize this, and it belongs to the sphere of post-Holocaust Jewish reflection. It brings to mind an extract from a prose piece written by the poet Paul Celan. Now, for those of you who don't read German, we have included the English as well. For the Jew, you know it well. What does he possess that truly belongs to him, which is not on loan, borrowed, never to be returned? I work in a lending and research library, and while we stamp the books in our circulating collection, I don't think I've ever regarded these books as being owned by the JPL. We're caretakers. And in the case of our rare book collection, of which 1,500 unstamped books out of a collection of 1,800 are from the Offenbach archival depot, the relationship is a bit different. We see ourselves as adoptive parents. The ERR, which stands for the Einsdandstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, had confiscated libraries and archives from every country the Germans invaded and incorporated them into several research institutions in the Reich for use by the Institute for Research on the Jewish Question. The Nazis seized and confiscated Jewish property. Precious metals from these objects were initially melted down and manuscripts burned, but the sheer volume of material, overwhelmed by the mechanisms of destruction, which was then transported to the Jewish Museum in Prague, where the Jewish curators were forced to catalog thousands of items received each day. This was a place where the Nazis sought to preserve and exhibit the material as decadent, barbaric, and depraved in a plan that would establish something called the Museum to an Extinct Race. This was to advance the theory that the Jews were an inferior race which had to be exterminated. Okay. I could use a little of those batteries too. The irony of this museum to an extinct race was that this actually allowed these books to be preserved throughout the war and through the Holocaust. And that was the irony. When the war ended, these books and artifacts were hidden in order to be protected against air raids. They were these caches of books were found by American and British soldiers from the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives units, the MFAR units, which you probably know as the Monuments Men, these that made up the film, the George Clooney film, I think. And they were tasked with the protection and security of cultural property and sites during the final combat operations of the war. Now, these books were moved to the city of Offenbach in the western sector, in the American sector of Germany, located on the former premises of the IG Farben Chemicals plant in Offenbach. Farben might be a name known to some of you. It was that chemical plant that also produced the Zyklon B gas used in the extermination of people in the Jews and so many other groups in the concentration camps. Books, manuscripts, incunabula, and other objects of Jewish origin plundered by the Nazis were piled there in tidy blocks or packed in crates. Between April and August of 1946, Gershom Scholem, who that name also might be known to many of you, he was the great scholar of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. He traveled through the ashes of the Jewish cultural landscapes of Europe through Vienna and Paris and Berlin to investigate the fate of Nazi-looted property of the Allied forces had found on German territory. What becomes important here is that he was tasked with this not by a government or on behalf of a nation. He was tasked by this through a committee that was formed at Hebrew University, which was an institution governed by British Mandate Palestine. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany became one of the central bodies, along with others that administered restitution. But the dilemma for people like Scholem and people like Hannah Arendt and others was that they had all slammed up against a dilemma. Restitution to the encroaching totalitarian and anti-Semitic governments in Eastern Europe became a significant barrier in an effort to secure the future of these books. Scholem ended up at the OAD, which became the collection point where looted property was stored, sorted, and identified. He found more than 3 million volumes sent there to await restitution. In December of 1945, Lieutenant Leslie Post of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program recommended Seymour Pomerantz as the director of the OAD. The Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Organization, in conjunction with the Office of Military Government, United States, assumed governance over the American sector of occupied Germany, and it was this organization who administered the project. There were other institutional players. Holocaust historian Lucy Davidovich, who worked at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which is also referred to as the Joint, came to the foreground here because she and others felt that the thousands of books and documents that were originally part of the YIVO collection in Vilna should be transplanted to the new YIVO headquarters in New York City. The Library of Congress was also intimately involved in the political narrative, but the JCRI realized that even though libraries such as the Bibliotheca Rosenthaliana in Amsterdam had their entire collections returned to them, many other libraries had been destroyed, and it was not possible to return these books to their original owners. There were no owners left. Now, I don't think you can use the term watershed to describe a particular question, but in this instance, a question arose which became not only pivotal, but also divisive. The pre-state Jewish population in British Mandate Palestine was regarded by this committee at the Jewish National University Library, Hebrew University, as the logical heir of and successor to the murdered Jews of Europe, and should have the right to claim heirless Jewish cultural property on German soil. But when it came to salvaging the YIVO library, a fundamental question arose as to who should be the authoritative voice of the Jewish people. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, the terms Jewish people, world Jewry had no clear definition, and it meant different things to different people depending on ideological and political beliefs. The term peoplehood, nation, race, religion, ethnicity, these ideas were all products of political emancipation, linguistic and cultural assimilation, religious denominationalism, and nationalism. It's a well-known narrative that the Jewish people spoke with one voice only once in history at the foot of Sinai. But a few thousand years later, there were voices from British Mandate Israel, British Mandate Palestine, voices from the American diaspora, and the lingering question as to whether Europe could once again be a place of safety for Jews in the fullness of time. Now, there have been so many publications written about Offenbach and about the JCRI. I have a very, very large bibliography. If you were interested, I'd be very happy to send it to you after this session is over. But in the interest of time, that was really a snapshot of what happened after the war. What I would like to talk about very quickly is the Canadian experience, which will be comparatively short for very good reason. The story of heirless assets that came to Canada has yet to be fully told. The transfer from the Offenbach archival depot to Canada was not recorded with anything other than with vague memos of intent and some apocryphal narrative. We know that it was decided that Jewish cities with significant Jewish populations merited the donation of some of these books. In 1951, a little over 204,000 Jews lived in Canada. Almost 81,000 Jews lived in Montreal. Toronto, by comparison, had 67,000. Winnipeg had about 16,000. Montreal seemed like the most logical place for these books, and that's pretty much where most of them ended up. Now, for the last 9 years, we've searched our own archives and those of the Alex Dworkin Canadian Jewish Archives, with whom we work very closely. And we searched for anything that would have shown a connection back to the original orphanage and the transfer specifically of antiquarian Judaica. We found this memo in the Canadian Jewish Congress archives. Saul Hayes, who was director at that time, received notice that there was the intention to ship some OAD books to Canada and that they would be absorbed by Jewish libraries. In May of 1950, a communique was sent to the Canadian Jewish Congress from the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Organization, which confirmed the transfer. So essentially, this memo here really just confirms the original intent. And to this date, this is pretty much all we have found. This is only the only recorded evidence that we have found that describe the transfer of heirless property to Canada. Relative to Canada, there are articles and books that have been published over the last 20 years that describe the transfer of property to the United States and to other universities. Now, we also know that the Winnipeg Jewish Library received some of these books, but that they were soon transferred to the Lowy Collection at Library and Archives Canada. I confirmed with the head of the Lowy Collection, our colleague Michael Kent, who told me that their rare material includes books with the CJC bookplate, the Canadian Jewish Congress bookplate, indicating that it was part of the transfer from Europe. In 1952, Levi Becker, who was a Reconstructionist rabbi and businessman, along with Joseph Cage, who oversaw the Jewish Immigration Aid Services, received these books at the Canadian Jewish Congress. Canadian Jewish Congress retained about 200 volumes, many of which have the JCRI stamps on them. But 1,500 were transferred to the Jewish Public Library, where they joined an existing collection of rare books that had been acquired by one of the JPL's two founders, Yehuda Kaufman. As I mentioned at the beginning, our books are not stamped. And although some have marginalia, and we brought one of them, which I can show you later, on the back table, our attempts to establish provenance have relied on conjecture and educated guesses. What I would like to leave you with is a current initiative that in large part has been the result of a collaboration that took place last year that we ran with the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, as you may know, a number of years ago, if you're familiar with the Footprints Project, this was launched as a collaborative effort in the US. This is a project that tracks the movement of early printed Jewish books. Information about the movement of early printed books exists, but in scattered form. Individual copies, catalogs from libraries and booksellers, estate inventories, subscription lists, other kinds of archival documents. It was really necessary to begin tying together all of these connections. And once you do that, you build up a composite view of the movement of Jewish texts from place to place and across time. And this is really the essence of provenance. Provenance is partially about restitution, but it's also about mapping the orientation that these books take across time and space. Now, after our collaboration with UPenn and another one we did with Brandeis, a collaboration began between several university libraries in the US to catch up on the identification and cataloging of books known to have been shipped to US libraries from Offenbach. Until now, each library or institution working to identify and properly catalog the books received, they've been more or less working independently. But I don't need to tell you that librarians are collaborative by nature, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. And in recent conference presentations through the AJL, the Association of Jewish Libraries, and informal conversations, it's been abundantly clear that all such institutions would benefit greatly from working together. Minimally to share information and develop best practices, maximally to plan joint ventures and grant applications. This led to the creation of the AJL Task Force on Nazi-era looted books. And while this likely would have happened despite our collaboration with UPenn, we like to take credit where it's due. We really sparked this off. And the irony here is that we actually can contribute to this because our books are not stamped. Now, I'll just finish off here. When I started working as a clerk at the JPL in the early 1980s, these books, these 1,800 books, were squirreled away in the far corner of our basement. And when I asked one of my predecessors what they were, he responded dismissively, "Oh, it's our rare book collection." "How did we get them?" I asked with some incredulity. He told me, "Oh, they came to us after the war. The Hebrew University got all the good stuff, and they just shipped us the Chazarai." For those of you not familiar with Latin, Chazarai is the Yiddish word for trash. In this way, I have to say that my colleagues' dismissiveness was a gift, because even though our 1,500 Offenbach books may not be the most beautiful amongst the 3 million that were in the depot, There is beauty in telling their stories, which is what we've been doing for the last 9 years with our Rare Book Workshop initiative. We're very proud of our orphans, and we're really glad that we can tell you their story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. It's really a privilege to learn about those orphans and to have some of them present today. So for those of you who are in the room, we'll have a session after my comments, and you can go and encounter these books for yourselves. I'm going to tell you a little bit to give the opposite side of the story of some of these Judaica collections for whom we know their stories. We know how they came to be here. We know who collected them, who created them, and we know their stories. So there's another side to this story. There's the untold stories that you've been telling for 9 years through this initiative at the Jewish Public Library. And at McGill, we actually do have some substantial Judaica collections. So while the stories of the owners and books from the Offenbach Depot do remain untraceable sometimes, but work in progress, we are fortunate to have known provenance for our collections here. They're the work of individual collectors with passions for Jewish literature, poetry, culture, and history. And each collector and collection has a unique story and interest. Their collections testify to those interests and those passions. And I'm going to introduce you to 4 collectors, and you'll see some of their collections on display and some of them in pictures on screen. So I'll start with the earliest that you see an example of on screen here, and that's the collection of Rabbi Daniel Lewin. He was born in Poland and died here in Montreal in 1997, but he did move to Canada in 1948. Following a period in London, England. He served congregations and as students as rabbi and principal of Hebrew schools in London, England, Cornwall, Ontario, and Saint-Agathe, Quebec. He passed the end of his life here in Montreal, and he really had a passion for Jewish history and collecting, in which he followed in his father's footsteps. His father was named Louis Lewin, or Louis Lewin, a Polish Jewish historian and rabbi, and he also collected papers and scientific works extensively in pre-war Poland. His collection is now housed at the Yeshiva University in Israel, and his son's lives here. There are about 168 volumes in Rabbi Lewin's collection, and it's really notable because it's almost entirely sacred works. So works on the scriptures, works on a scholar, works on interpretation, and his papers are actually at the Jewish Public Library. So further research projects between the 2 collections are definitely possible for those who are interested. I pulled a couple of selections from this collection, notable for their age. So his collection, a lot of them are less stable, so we don't have as many examples out because the bindings are victims of their age. This one, for instance, is an antique daily Jewish prayer book. It was printed in Germany in 1894. And the cover that you see there is original. It's a paneled faux ivory, probably a celluloid material, with a metal frame and clasp. It's ornamented with a metal border and a velvet-backed central tablet with metal rosettes. It's really a lovely item. It's about the size of your palm, so it would very comfortably fit in the hand. It's printed on paper and it is particularly brittle, so I don't have it out today. And the glue on the spine gave up quite a long time ago. But it's a beautiful example of something that would have been a cherished object that would have been used for daily reference and consultation. Unlike the other collections, Rabbi Lewin's selections are almost entirely sacred, making the whole of it a really important resource for religious study. We do have selections of Hebrew sacred texts in other collections as well, but Rabbi Lewin's is one that's quite unique for being intact and containing quite a lot of early material. The next collector I want to introduce you to is named Norman Friedman, and he too lived here in Montreal. However, he was a native of Montreal. He did graduate from McGill as well. In 1921, he had a Bachelor of Commerce. And he worked for insurance and phonograph companies throughout his career. And he was also later in life the president of Allen's, which was a candy manufacturing company, as well as a clothing manufacturing company. So he was a businessman, and collecting, however, was his passion. And he had specific interests. Unlike Rabbi Lewin, his collection of Judaica is almost entirely secular. He collected largely Victorian, Anglo-Saxon, and Edwardian literature. He was fascinated by the early works and first editions of Stephen Leacock and Rudyard Kipling, and one other artist whose works I have pulled out and a selection of them today, Arthur Szyk. He donated a number of his collections to McGill in 1946, including his collection by Polish-Jewish artist Arthur Szyk. Szyk worked as a book illustrator and political artist. His style might be familiar to some of you. He illustrated many, many things across popular culture. Stamps, posters, illustrated books. He has a richly illustrated edition of the Haggadah, which I have out at the back, and you can feel free to turn pages. It's quite a stable edition. In 1933, when Hitler took power in Germany, Szyk drew his caricatures, and he also caricaturized other political leaders of the Axis powers, so Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito. And it gained him a lot of popularity and recognition in the United States, where he eventually permanently moved. His drawings appear everywhere, as I said, in newspapers, magazines, posters, and I'll go to the next slide. You can see two, and also this is the one that I mentioned, that is the Haggadah. So it's a beautifully luxurious edition. The other things that I have out today include studies for postage stamps, posters, and prints. There are some 22 pieces of artwork in the collection here that have been digitized, and you can find them in our archival catalog as well. So Szyk's collection here is beautiful. It's also been the subject of research work and exhibitions over the years, and there's an active society that promotes and does research on Szyk's illustrations. Another example of his work, this one is a print on Jewish festivals. The next collector that I want to introduce you to is Saul Shapiro. He collected Anglo-American Judaica, and it was given to his collection was given here to McGill by his family, and includes over 5,000 books and volumes of journals. Many books are signed first editions. He was a collector with an extensive network amongst scholars, amongst authors, and it shows in the books in his collection. He collected Jewish history, biography, works on Jewish-Christian relations, and a lot on Jewish art, cinema, and literary criticism. Professor Emeritus Barry Levy of the Department of Jewish Studies had an instrumental role in arranging this gift to McGill. We know his provenance, and we're grateful and fortunate to steward this collection here. It can tell you a lot, like every collection can, about its collector. In this case, it tells us that Saul Shapiro had a passion for literature and an extensive network of authors, poets, and friends in the book world. Almost each book in his collection has one or more newspaper clippings, review clippings, notes, bills of sale, receipts, or inscriptions from the authors who gifted their copies to Shapiro. His collection documents that network. One example you'll see out at the back and on screen is a work by Montreal poet and professor Abraham Moses Klein, more often known as A.M. Klein. You'll see two of Klein's works out today, gifted to Shapiro by Klein himself and here at McGill for the benefit of students. I can fill in a couple of gaps about Shapiro that his books can't tell you directly. He was born in Canada in 1910 and began collecting books at 12 years old. I think some of us probably did too. He, however, only switched to collecting exclusively Judaica in the 1970s. He worked most of his life in the People's Department Store here in Montreal. And in his own words, in an interview in 1977, he said, "I'm Canadian born, so for some reason, no matter how much I read about the Holocaust, the more difficult it is for me to fathom the cruelty of that period. It's inconceivable, and at the same time, no one should forget that it did happen." One of the volumes I chose to pull out today is one that Saul Shapiro compiled himself. During the periods of 1938 to 39, he compiled two scrapbooks that documented caricatures and satirized cartoons depicting Hitler and the Nazi regime. So there's 2 volumes at the back that show very much images from the time and the way that they were presented in the newspaper as received by Shapiro here in Canada. It's an interesting perspective, but it is, like so much of what we're talking today, difficult subject matter. The last collector I want to introduce you to is perhaps my favorite, partly because he infused his collection with his own personal artistic tastes and flair as well. His name is Joe Fishstein, and he was a garment worker in the Bronx. And like the others I've mentioned, and I imagine everyone who's here today, both online and in the room, was a lover of books. He particularly loved Yiddish language and poetry and literature. His collection of Yiddish poetry is really extraordinary. It's close to 3,000 works of 20th century Yiddish literature, including many, many rare items, and more interestingly, perhaps, many items for which he made his own custom book jackets. You can see his art and handwriting there. That's the spine of his own personal catalog of his collection. And this is an example of his style of calligraphy and ornamentation. He collected Yiddish poetry and had a standing order in with nearly every publisher of note, primarily collecting works from Eastern Europe and the United States. The Holocaust and the purges in Russia did effectively destroy the pre-war wellspring of Yiddish literature and literary activity. But Fishstein's collection, so very lovingly created, curated, and cared for, gives lovers of Yiddish literature a chance to see that creativity in its flowering. In the words of Ruth Weiss, in the preface to her book, Joe Fishstein had wanted his books to look as precious as they felt to him, so that their beauty should be palpable. You can see this example at the back of the room. One of the ones that is made out of, it's interesting to survey his collection, to be honest, because it seems like he used materials that were around and everyday. Some of them appear to be wallpaper. Some of them appear to be made out of contact paper that you might use to line cabinets, counters, and the like. And he also used scraps likely from his work in the garment industry. So you see a combination here of a dust jacket created out of those found materials and also his own personal calligraphy. So that brings my collector introductions to an end. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in and attending. And we now invite those who are here in person, we'll invite you can go to the back and tour the books that we have out. We do have some time for questions, and I think Eddie and myself, if we're able to field them, we will happily answer, or we can also follow up with resources, including the extensive bibliography that Eddie mentioned. For those of you online, if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll voice them on your behalf. And we'll wrap up in about 5 minutes if we don't have any more questions, and that'll leave us time to look at the books in person if you didn't have a chance before the event. So thank you all for attending, and thank you, Eddie and Rachel, for helping us plan this and to bring together some orphans with some books that have been part of a well-loved family and collection. So thank you. We'll take questions. And if there are none, which is fine, I do invite you to feel free to stand up. I will give you a couple of notes about the books that we have out in person. There are a number where it says, please do not touch. I ask that you respect that. And the ones where it does not say that, we will also be around and mingling. So you can ask us if you feel unsure, just ask, and we may be able to turn pages for you or tell you a little bit more about the items. Yeah. Yes.
It occurred to me while you were letting me speak, all that full confession, I work here. So,
Stephen Spodak, everyone.
so I want to mention the occurred to me while you were both speaking, that many of the collections here, what's fascinating about them is that there's a story behind it. There's a story behind the person who gave them to us. We purchased them from.
Absolutely.
I just the point of fact, as an example, Jacquelyn is being very kind this coming Thursday, meet with a student journalist who's writing an article, for instance, for our rare children's collection, which is published probably one of the most important of its kind in Canada. And I happen to know the collector, who's now 97, going on 98 years old, and he was started collecting at the age of 9 years old.
Yeah.
Because he unfortunately suffered from polio and was bedridden. So what did she do? She read. She read children's material, and then, as I've learned over many, many years, it developed into a passion for collecting. And Sheila just, would scan the catalogs and buy things. And we're now very lucky home of that world-class spiritual.
I'll pause you for a moment, Stephen, to give a summary for the online crowd who can't hear you quite as well. Yeah, I should have mentioned that you need to come up for the mic to pick you up. I know. So I'll give you a summary for everyone online. What Stephen was saying is that every collector has a unique story, and learning about them is also one of the joys of rare books librarianship. Often when we do have known collectors, the one that Stephen mentioned is Sheila Burke, whose collection of children's material is housed here, and of which I'm now the privileged enough to be the curator. And it's a brilliant collection that she started at the age of 9 when she contracted polio and consequently had a lot of time to read and was bedridden. Now she's well into her 90s, and I just received a lovely Christmas card from her over the holidays saying that she wished she could still continue to collect and is still chasing. Yes, and she's still chasing though a first edition of Alice in Wonderland. Yes, and so it's interesting to get that perspective into collectors' lives, because the other thing that comes with collections a lot of the time is papers and documentation about their purchasing. Some collectors are much more organized than others, and we bless them for that because we have a documentation of the publishing houses that they work with, of the catalogs that they reviewed, and the like. And like all of the things that Eddie mentioned that give us known provenance of books like stamps and the like. Yes, question.
I also I'm a book lover, but I'm also a photo historian, and there's also pictures of the processing of all those books. Do you know more about those books or those photos and who took them? Are there more?
The question was, do we know who took the photos of I guess it was the organization and the sorting at Offenbach. Those photos were probably taken by staff of the US military who assumed governance over Offenbach during the time the Americans, had governed that sector. So those photographs, for the most part, I think, are military photographs. And there are photographs that you can see on the internet with books that are just piled high. You see, Farben was a chemical plant, so they needed that space to store these 3 million books. And actually, one of the stories you told, you were talking about Joe Fishstein, Jacquelyn. Ruth Weiss tells a story. It just reminded me. Ruth Weiss tells a story. She was the one, I think, who first discovered Fishstein's collection in this 3 or 4 floor walk-up in Brooklyn, I think it was. And it was a fire hazard. He had books that were stacked from floor to ceiling, and they had trouble getting it out. They had trouble extricating all of those books, because, as you said, he had a standing order. He had every Yiddish book that had been printed in Eastern Europe and the States for the most part. But that people are very passionate about collections, and 3 million books. I mean, if you could imagine a warehouse of 3 million books and having to identify them, arrange them, enact some form of restitution, it was an Herculean task. I should also point out, I want to mention one other thing. Over the last few years, we were the beneficiaries of 2 large collections of miniature books. I know you have a collection of miniature books here at McGill, and Kristen Howard, who was the practicum student from CIS, who originally launched this project, who's now a librarian, a liaison librarian here. Now, we know about the provenance because we actually met with the 2 donors, and one donation came as early as last year. We have about 3,000 miniature books in our collection. Not all of them are rare. Some of them are extremely unusual. The story that articulates the passion people have for book collecting is that Daisy Gross and Lily Toth, they knew each other. They were, I guess, the term that really annoys me, frenemies. They were friends, but kind of rivals. They would go on shopping jaunts together, and the minute Daisy saw a book she liked, Lily would buy it. And Daisy, I mean, she was complaining laughingly about it when we took her collection. But they no longer had the room to store these collections of miniature books. And so now we have them. And not, I mean, they're not really Judaica books, but I mean, they're beautiful and they're, you know, each one tells a story. So.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you for questions. I think we'll sign off there and leave us some time to look at the selections we have out. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll say goodbye to the online crowd.